Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Barry Merrick. I'm co-founder and CEO at Ivy and the learning chair of YPO Metro New York. And it's my pleasure to introduce all of you to Keith Ferrazzi. Keith, hello. How are you today?
Hey, Barry. Great to be with you. Thanks.
So good to have you here with us. What a way to kick off our week. Really appreciate you joining us today. So to give everybody a little bit of perspective, we're going to be exploring with Keith's guidance today how we can all master the future of our work relationships. A little bit about Keith's background. I'm sure many of you have come across his work. He is an incredible individual. I actually first came across his work while I was at Harvard Business School, and his teachings had a huge influence on all of us on how we reframed how we thought about connections and relationships, both at work and at home. We also got to host an incredible event with him in his home in LA. That was also a transformative experience for me. He's the founder and CEO of Ferrazzi Greenlight, which is an LA-based research and consulting firm. He coaches team transformations at some of the greatest companies of our time, ranging from Delta, Verizon, General Motors, and also the World Bank. He's the New York Times bestselling author of Never Eat Alone and Who's Got Your Back. And he has just published a new book called Leading Without Authority. And we're going to be learning a lot from him. My personal goals for this conversation is to really get an understanding of how we can elevate our relationships at work by learning from Keith's 20 plus years in this field. And when it comes to those relationships, it's the ones that we have with our team, as well as with our external stakeholders, whether they're vendors, customers, or the communities that we serve at large. So without further ado, Keith, thanks again for being here. And to kick off, I really want to hear your thoughts on your philosophy when it comes to work relationships, how you frame them in your mind, and how has that been changing over the last few years since you and I last saw each other?
Yeah. Well, thanks. And I feel that the basic core of my belief system and our research hasn't fundamentally changed. What I have navigated over the last 20 years is identifying where are the highest return applications of that philosophy. So for anybody who knows me from my first work, Never Eat Alone, really it's about how do you open up opportunity for yourself, which I think is equally as important in this marketplace today, where opportunity seems scarce and there seems to be a panic or a concern around where do we find growth and how do we manage risk, et cetera, in our lives. So we should talk a little bit about how the application of this at this particular point in time is important. But at the core of all of my belief was that when you were trying to achieve relationships that opened up opportunity, whether that's for jobs, whether that's for growth of jobs, whether that's for new accounts, whether that's for entrepreneurship, et cetera. You had to lead by being very strategic, which a lot of people aren't. People are way too serendipitous about relationships. They are one of the lifebloods of our success. And yet we don't really have what we call a relationship action plan. You know, you've got financial plans, you've got strategies for your business, but you don't have a relationship action plan. And we have worked with some of the most prestigious CEOs, from Bill Gates to presidential candidates like President Obama, to help to identify how to create a relationship action plan to spur mission and growth. And every one of us deserves that. So strategic is the first. And then the next point after strategic is generous, because the people that you want to have a relationship with are unlikely to be putting you at the top of their priority list unless you lead with extraordinary generosity. I stumbled into that, as many people know, when I tell the story as a young man. My old man was a poor construction and steel worker in Pennsylvania, unemployed a lot because the steel industry was suffering in the 70s. And I made a strong commitment to grow up someday and come back and make a difference to the industrial Pennsylvania that I loved so much. And I was on that path. And what was interesting is what really accelerated that path was the relationships that I gained at the country club, at the golf course. And that, unbeknownst to me, I was leading with generosity. And there's a wonderful little story I tell about my father making me show up at the golf course a half of an hour early. And as a result of doing that, I was able to have better information than my fellow caddies. And as a result, certain golfers really appreciated that I took a couple of strokes off their golf score. And that generosity led to them being concerned about me, which opened up doors to me that ultimately got me into Yale University. And so for each of us, I think the most important lesson to know is that to be in relationship with an individual is to be of service. And really understanding, and I spend many of my works in my three bodies of work that I've published now, Never Alone, Who's Got Your Back, and Leading Without Authority, thinking about that. I actually think Leading Without Authority is my most important work right now, because it's the culmination of 20 years landing at a point in time. And then the third thing is the criticality once you are in relationship with someone based on generosity and service, you have a moment of time to solidify loyalty, to solidify the intimacy, the connection. And through that, you do it through vulnerability. You do it, and this is something that, Brene Brown and many others have written a lot about. Amy Edmondson have studied, and it's really wonderful. I feel quite blessed. Some extraordinary people like Adam Grant early on were influenced by Never Eat Alone in my work and went off to do incredible research that proved what I sort of knew instinctively based on my own experiences. Generosity, vulnerability, these things are crucial connected ties to deepen relationships that can be quite productive. Now, the question is, what do you do with those and how do you manage them? And that's where I've been coming to today in my research.
Excellent, Keith. Thank you so much. So just so we have an idea also, over the last 20 years, there have been tremendous trends in terms of how people work. Obviously, most recently, we all had this forced experiment of we all had to be remote work. But even before that, the increased role of technology, the ability with which people communicate in different ways was changing. So could you share with us your latest thoughts on where work relationships, how they've been evolving over the recent years, and where you think they will be going after this pandemic experience?
Yeah, and Fast Company, I think, published the first chapter of my new book. This new book, Leading Without Authority, has been under research for 8 years. And I agree with you. There have been some pretty radical changes made to how we work. What I have been frustrated by is that we have not solidified those changes in our org design. We've not solidified those changes in our leadership behaviors and competencies. What I mean by that is you've got a few people like my friend Tony Shea at Zappos, who does a great job of being out ahead of the pack and thinking about how organization design aligns around how we actually are working today. The reality is we're working in networks today, right? So take another friend, Peter Diamandis, to be transformative, to be exponential. If you know Peter's work, his work is extraordinary, helping us understand 10x and 11 and 10x and 100x doesn't take any more time than 10%. The reality is it's how you think and it's what you do. So I coach Peter's team actually, and coming behind his perspective of exponentialism, I come behind that saying, now what are the behaviors of exponentialism? How do we achieve that? How do we bulletproof our organization against unsuspected risk? How do we unleash pent-up innovation in our teams that find unexpected growth opportunities that are lying around us, but we don't see them because we're working through a traditional momentum, right? And so that's been what I've been working on for about 8 years to document. And the first chapter, it's called The New Work Rules for a New Work World. You'd think that I wrote this post-pandemic, but the reality is I've been, and so have so many others. We've been screaming from the from the rafters into the hills about the need for work to change. And now what's happened is, you said, a forced mechanism. Work has changed. In the last 3 months, we've seen more disruption, right? But also more innovation than we've seen in 20 years. And so I have started a new effort called Go Forward to Work, because I'm very frustrated by companies talking about getting back to work. I think going back to work is a mindset that you start to see even in society today, where people are rushing back in to assume some sense of normalcy, but things aren't normal today. And we may have some significant risk in those assumptions. And I don't want your teams to go back to that, because you've got a unique opportunity in the next couple of months to redefine your teams, to redefine your, I call it a social contract or a recontracting of how your people show up to work. If your people are not showing up if your people have just gone through a sense of radical adaptability, but I am worried for you as leaders if your people do not assume a go forward stance of constant radical adaptability, right? And so I would like to help you recontract what your team thinks of itself, how you interact with your team, how your team interacts with each other. Because if you do, I believe you'll be bulletproofed for the future, and you'll be growing in a scarce environment. And if you don't, you're going to be whipsawed like the markets are, which I don't want for any entrepreneur out there, or young careerist.
Right. What's fascinating about what you're saying is you already had kind of crystallized your views on the fact that our org structures and the way we do business hadn't adapted to our new technologies, exponential growth, global communications in a way that it should have. The pandemic forced the change, and we can either choose to quote unquote go back to work and try to attain that sense of normalcy, which wasn't anyways ideal in the first place, or we can redefine, we can actually future-proof ourselves.
Exactly.
So
exactly. And by the way, let me just say this. My other point is that this radical adaptability, but we need to be exponential every step. We need to find and unleash innovation in places that it has not traditionally existed. The reason I know this is I spend so much of my time battling against executives who believe that for them to be transformational, they need more power and control. They need more resources. For a chief marketing officer to achieve the kind of growth that they want to achieve, they feel like they've got to own product development. They feel they've got to own data analytics instead of the strategy group, or they've got to be more prominent than the sales organization in running the field sales support. I mean, bullshit. It's irrelevant. We have been, for anybody, and I wrote a piece in Harvard Business Review not long ago, why chief marketing officers turn over so frequently. And it's because they've got to stop their mindset of being the chief marketing officer, controlling what they're controlling, and they need to be the shepherds of growth. But everybody can be the shepherds of growth. It doesn't require a title. It requires you to be a shepherd of growth. And so leading without authority takes the insights of Never Eat Alone, which is about the earnest capacity to enlist people with you for opportunity, right? And takes that and bundles it with your ability to put an exponential strategic vision of where we might go, but then realize that the path between a fuzzy vision today and where you are will be co-created with extraordinary people. Now, I've dropped a few names since we've been here, like Peter Diamandis. Peter's a dear friend of mine. He's on my team. He and I speak more than once a week. He's got an extraordinary new business in the immunology world of antibody testing and vaccines around the COVID business, and I'm on his board, right? Peter is constantly helping me think about the pivot that I'm making to bring products to a broader solution set in the marketplace than just the Fortune 100. He's on my team, right? Does he have a title? No. Could I have ever afforded him? No. But that principle, I call it teaming out. You know, there's not a single entrepreneur here who can't today have the most extraordinary team achieving the most extraordinary things, some of which happen to report to you, some of which you happen to pay, but others, they don't, right? And so how are you truly teaming out for your greatness and for an extraordinary vision you could have never created otherwise? And that is, I have to say, if you're the only one thinking that way, you need to make sure your entire team is thinking that way. You need to recontract that with your team. Does that make sense, Barry?
Absolutely. I'm really excited to dive into this. I think all of us are hungry to learn how we can do better when it comes to this. So for everybody participating live, I encourage you to In addition to listening actively, questions, I welcome you to type them into the Q&A box. And the latter third of this conversation will dedicate it to audience questions. So we're going to dive in. Keith, I want to ask you, so essentially, on the one hand, you have your new book that provides a number of frameworks and best practices. You also go into huge companies to think about transformation and how they can do business better. I want for this to be as action-oriented as possible for all of us here in the limited time we have. I want to ask you, if you were to come into one of our companies tomorrow, okay, what is the framework that you use? Like, what are the key factors you look at to take our teams to the next level from an internal perspective? If you could give us a bird's eye view of what that framework is constituted by, what are the different factors, then maybe we can take a couple minutes to go into each one, where you maybe you can challenge us on how we should be perhaps thinking about things differently or doing things differently.
Yeah, I am really desperate to help you think about this recontracting process. I think it's at the kernel of everything I'm talking about. And I'm really desperate to make sure that you can do it to start by yourself, right? I want you to begin this recontracting process. And I did a really nice webinar just on this as well with Peter Diamandis. And I've been putting a lot of work on this. I'll tell you what happens. To recontract with your team, you need a precipitating moment. Now, if you, for God's sakes, if you haven't gotten a precipitating moment with this pandemic, I don't know what the hell you're going to be able to use to get it there, but this is it. Here you are, slapped in the face with this crazy pandemic, right? Most of you working remotely, not sure what the next 6 months look like, right? In terms of your markets. I mean, all of this, if this isn't the time to say, you know, are we working as effectively together in this new world? And I would imagine that everybody could admit that the world is new today. Now, here's the thing. The world's been new for 20 damn years, right? And we've been clinging to old ways of working. Use this as an opportunity to push reboot in a way that we should have been doing 20 years ago. I mean, and I'll give you, we have a model of 8 elements that we have been researching for 10 years now that we believe is the model that will allow you to be fortified and resilient, right, for this future, and leaning into a growth mindset. So you know what a growth mindset is for individuals. We've read this. What we've been looking at is, what is a growth mindset for teams? So I'm going to give you these 8 areas, but what I want you to think about is you are under curating the organism called a team. You're under curating it. And I had as well in my life. I had so over programmed the relationship, which was a hub and spoke to me. And so did leadership. Leadership has over curated the relationship between you as a leader and the individuals you lead. And not only that, but, well, let me just pause there for a second. The first thing that I want you to rethink is that the team, this needs to go through a massive shift to be incredibly effective. The shift that it's gone through in the past is that you're at the center of the team and it's on a hub and spoke to you. And what you need to move to is a team, and I had to create a new word for this. The team needs to move to becoming co-elevating, going higher together. The commitment and the recontracting that you need to take your team through is that it's no longer hub and spoke to you. It's shifting the accountability, which used to be hub and spoke to you, the feedback, which used to be hub and spoke to you, the vision setting used to be hub and spoke to you. We need to shift from that overload on you into a shared load among the team. And once you begin to shift from overload to shared load, from hub and spoke to peer, right? Which is interesting. If you look back at my work, it was emerging in that direction. When I wrote Who's Got Your Back, I was really talking about the criticality of peer-to-peer relationships in personal transformation. And what I've evolved from that book, which was 8 years ago, I guess, is the recognition that peer-to-peer is the critical unleashing of exponential success in organizations. So your ability to coach your team to be more peer-to-peer and less hierarchical, more peer-to-peer and less hub and spoke to you, where you become the chokehold of all innovation, is absolutely unleashing. So there are 8 attributes. And now, again, I believe that we can utilize the time that we're in today to do this recontracting. And you can just go back to your team and say, hey, listen, I heard this webinar from this guy, Ferrazzi. And by the way, this is the credentializing. About 2016, I was coaching the executive team at Cisco with John Chambers. And I saw remote work as something that was coming down the pike. And I asked John if I could raise some money from him. And then I went to Accenture and Siemens Communications. I raised $2 million. And we did 4 years of research on what are the people rules in a remote world. No, and by the way, nobody gave a damn back then. I published 18 to 20 pieces in Harvard Business Review and Fast Company. And I think it was like crickets. Nobody asked me for a speech on it. There were a couple of webinar companies asked me for a speech on it. Nobody cared. And then all of a sudden the pandemic hits and everybody's remote, and Zoom now found this stuff and named me the thought leader of remote teams. And I've been on Harvard Business Review, stand-ups, Fast Company, et cetera. So use the fact that we're remote and blended now as a capacity, and in this crazy frenetic world, use that as the excuse why it's time to recontract with your team. That's my point. And go to a website I created called Virtual Teams Win, virtualteamswin.com. If you go to the resource center there, you could follow along. There are 8 elements that I want you to recontract. And I even give you a little script that I want you to give to your team, right, as to how do we recontract. Let me give you the bundles of them. The first issue is that we as a team have to start using each other for breakthrough collaboration. It's interesting how little collaborative engagement, co-creation exists inside of our teams to solve our problems. We get heads down with the work that we do. Your team is earnestly trying to do the work with the resources they have. Whereas I've now launched an online course business, which I never had before. And my team members are guys like Peter Diamandis and Jim Quick and some of the great leaders, Vishen from Mind Valley. These are the team members that have been coaching me, right, and guiding our efforts to bring to audiences $500 courses on how to do what I charge $500,000 for, right? Not to say that it's an equal substitute, but my point is I pivoted the whole business, but I wouldn't have been able to do it if my earnest little team was just doing their job. Teaming out and using our time for radical co-creation and collaboration. I have rebooted the use of the staff meeting to no longer be report outs, but staff meeting is time for co-creation and collaboration and going to the next exponential level. And that little shift of 50% of your staff meeting being curated for breakthrough questions, bringing in from the outside critical experts that co-create, right? That bundle of work. In that bundle of work, you have you have 2 of the 8. You have great high-performing teams use their time for collaborative problem solving, which unleashes innovation. And great high-performing teams team out. They think more broadly about who their team is, much more broadly than org charts or company boundaries or pay, et cetera, it means. So that's a big area. The other thing I want you to be thinking about is I want you to adopt agility. Now, many of you may be doing this, but we've been talking about it for a long time. White collar agility is, I was just working with the head of HR at Unilever. They went from 6 months for product development life cycles to 20 days by adopting an agile process. Very simply, what an agile process does is agility shifts you from, shifts you into sprints, which allow you to pivot, do micro pivots on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. And that weekly and monthly pivot allows you to stay ahead of the market forces that are constantly coming at you in ways that, that are going to either eat your lunch or you're going to utilize. And so there's the principle here is by going to these agile sprints for your business, you start to adopt what's very powerful is peer-to-peer accountability. Because when the stand-ups happen, you're not just standing and reporting out. You're standing and making every individual on your team is standing and making themselves open to what I call a process of bulletproofing. I've actually added this, having coached a lot of teams now through this agile process. I've added something to the traditional agile process, which is every time somebody stands up to report this, one of the 10 hills you're trying to take strategically, they need to get bulletproofed. To bulletproof is when the small group of individuals around you go into small group and come back forcefully with the answer to 3 questions. How can we challenge this person in ways they haven't been challenged to think? Meaning, what risks are they not seeing? What crazy ass innovation could we give this person that might spark something new? And the third is, how can I help you? This is a superfood. This bulletproofing process is a superfood for the organization of the future, where you actually have your team holding each other accountable, challenging each other. Do you realize that 71% of teams, this is in our research with our team coaching work that we do, 71% of teams say that they get no value from being in the team. They're not taking their thinking to the next level because they're a part of the team. 74% of teams say that they're not capable of challenging each other in the room. Those two, that just blows me away. And we've seen that consistently in organizations. Imagine if you as a leader, you had your teams that report to you, capable of having the psychological safety to challenge each other in the room, wrestle new ideas to another level, by the way, sometimes you don't even have to be there for them to be doing this. It's extraordinary. Imagine the value creation that we could unleash if we could create that peer-to-peer accountability through this process. And that candor. I mean, God, there's so much conflict avoidance that exists in teams. I see it across the board. So all of these things, the first stage, of course, is a recontracting where you become aware, but that's bullshit. That's like going offline and doing a leadership retreat and writing new values down, putting them up on a damn poster, right? Where only 6 months later, you're looking at them, and if you have any integrity, you realize you've been violating them since the day you wrote them, right? I mean, you need to move from this awakening that, yes, there is a new contract among us. We will challenge each other in the room. We will give each other feedback. We will coach each other up to another level of performance. Once you go from that awakening, now you got to practice. And there's very distinct practices that I talk a lot about, and we can do them here, we can do them at that resource center, but you need to do this reboot, and then you need to practice over a period of time. Yeah, so, and that's the other thing. We bundled all of this, for the first time I bundled all of this in an actual course that I'm really excited about how efficacious it is, because I've taken everything that I would have coached a team through and put it in a course on leadership, on how leaders need to lead differently. How do we need to lead our teams so that our teams lead each other? What does that mean for us as opposed to our traditional way of leading? And I put that on keithferrazzi.com. And I'm excited. I'm very excited about what's possible here in this new environment.
Excellent. Keith, thank you. So in essence, just my key takeaways here is that we've all been gifted this recalibration moment to recontract with ourselves, with our teams. In your view, 2 key things to do is, 1, really start to use each other for breakthrough growth, expand our definition of the team, and then get into a more agile mindset. What would be very helpful while we're here is to just go through a couple of examples of like very specific exercises we can do as a team, right? So most of us have team meetings already. There's elements of, I'm sure there's a spectrum of who's doing a great job of the things you said and who's doing a terrible job and everything in between. But if you were to just give us like a handful of like universally powerful practices that we can implement so that, we can already start moving the needle and build on those things. So what would be your week to week? What are some things you would implement?
Let me give you a few. The first thing is strategically work with your team to identify what are the 5 most important hills we're trying to take today for growth, right? And I would use a process that I call CPS, collaborative problem solving. what you need to do with that is identify a question like that. What are the 5 most important strategic hills we need to take? And then I want you to begin to consider going into small breakout groups, because the psychological safety that you get in small breakout groups is fundamentally different than what you get from a big room conversation. You get so little from a big room, because people, the old momentum is that while I'm in a big room, I can't tell you what I'm really thinking. Because in a non-remote world, the real conversations happened after the meeting as you were walking down the hallway. And we need to bring those into the room. So small group dialogue, after having recontracted that we're going to be highly courageous and candid in the room, is where you actually get it. Now, the report back from a small room is where you get the truth telling. And interestingly enough, we found that about 15% of the candor that happens in a small room gets diluted when you report back, but only 15%. Because in the small room, you got 3 groups of individuals that are like, oh yeah, but we could never say that about the head of sales because he's such a jackass and he's blah, 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 right? I mean, that's what happens in the small room. But so that jackass comment isn't going to happen. But what will happen when they come back is that they will say something like, if the question is, what are the barriers to achieve our 5th hill, right? Maybe that's one of the collaborative questions. So you need to have this cadence of collaborative dialogue with your team that we're typically not using. And then once you get what the 5 hills are, and we go on these monthly sprints with owners of the 5 hills of growth, then each of those people stand up, and then they get the bulletproofing where they go to the small room, where we go to the small room again and come back with risk challenges, with innovation pushes, with help, offers of help. You're totally shifting the way the team used to be used for each other. Totally shifting, because most people went into their holes, got their work done, came back and plugged it in and reported. It's a fundamental shift. We have literally, this philosophy, the CFO of General Motors said that this is one of the primary reasons they didn't go back into bankruptcy. I mean, they companies have the strategies, but the executional capability of getting more out of your team through adopting co-elevating behaviors is totally transformative. By the way, I have been humbled and so proud of the Delta Airlines executive team. They are an extraordinary group of executives. And to participate, I almost feel it patriotic to see the strength of those executives working as hard as they are to redefine the future of their airline, and always, always, always having the customer at the center and safety at the center. I got to tell you, I feel like, I don't know that there's a public place that I would feel safer than on a Delta Airlines flight right now, truly. In terms, I'm more than at a restaurant. No offense to the restaurateurs, but so that's that. And then the next thing I would do is that you need to start adopting a higher degree of candor in rooms. And I have a philosophy. That remember that little character Yoda in Star Wars, that all wisdom exists in this little character. I believe that it exists in your team, but it doesn't exist if you don't get it out. So I've created a safe word called Yoda, where people can raise their hand and say Yoda moment, which means I'm about to take a risk. And the way you coach or practice that into behavior is having people stop in the middle of a meeting where you're a leader and say, listen, stop, go into a small room. But the reason I say go into a small room, it's so easy on Zoom or Microsoft Teams. You push a button and people are in breakout rooms for 5 minutes and then they come back. It's so easy to use the tools we have today to get psychological safety pumped into your room, instead of these droning on meetings where you're occupying all of the voice, right? So send them in the small room and tell them to come back ready to say what's not being said. What a powerful pause. What's not being said that needs to be said here? Go in a small room, come back. So powerful. So these are some of the things that, you talk about, very distinct practices that begin to coach these elements into reality. Because what happens is, like I said, you start with the recontracting by having a dialogue and say, yes, we want to be like this. Okay, boom, we got the recontract. The other thing I would say is, if you take a look at the 8 that I give you on Virtual Teams Win, have your team not overwhelm them. Don't say, we're going to be fundamentally different. Just ask your team, which one of these elements do we need to most focus on recontracting in the next 30 days? And focus on that. Usually it's candor or use of collaborative problem solving. Those are usually the 2 that they'll choose at the beginning. I want you to begin to install a different way of thinking about teaming out in terms of who you bring into your teams. I want you to begin to think about a little differently about agility in terms of monthly sprints of your work and how you're planning your work. Also, by the way, I want you to think about how you use tools differently. Most companies are not effectively using the communication tools. Most people are still playing scavenger hunt with email and text to find information. As entrepreneurs, we need to be utilizing channel communications in Slack, channel communications in Microsoft Teams, so that all the communications are aggregated around a specific thread. We need to think about project management software differently. If you're not using an Asana or, again, Teams, there's a lot of project management software. If you're not using that at the executive team level while you're in a remote basis, you're going to be in trouble. Because interestingly enough, a lot of people focus on the physical distance that exists in having gone remote. But the reality is it's strategic distance, lack of alignment, operational distance, right? Lack of coordination, and affinity distance, lack of intimacy and connection, where there's psychological safety. It's strategic, operational, and affinity distance that are going to bite you in the butt, not the physical distance. So you've got to recontract and close that gap of strategic distance, operational distance, and affinity distance.
So you mentioned this is really critical. You talked about some great questions we can ask each other to really push for candor and radical collaboration. I love the Yoda example. You have a Yoda behind you, so that was good to see visually. What I want to just, if you could give us like quick examples, right? One, what are other critical questions we can ask that you found to be very powerful? You already mentioned the 5 most important hills we want to take for growth. That's a great quote unquote conversation starter to focus the team, to assign responsibilities. What other ones, that's on the qualitative side, with your team?
Yeah. What are the 5 most critical hills? I talked about that. And then for each hill, you want to start bulletproofing those. You want to ask the question, what are the highest likely risks that are going to stop us from achieving that particular hill, right? And you need to get that out, and you need to make sure that you're using the small group format to make sure we're wringing out the truth in these questions. And a lot of the times, there's the risks are us. The risks are our own capacity to perform. There's a great question that I help teams think about, which is, I call it behavioral engineering. And it's a question that I know at the end will probably be, because we're actually going to program certain new behaviors to the team. But I will always ask the team the following question: which fewest people or roles need to change what behavior for us to unleash the growth opportunity, or for us to unleash our strategy? What people and roles? So if you're a small team, then it's about people. And you can say, the leader being a chokehold of innovation because everything goes through the leader. That is a shift of behavior. And if you can get your team to courageously acknowledge that you are actually a chokehold of innovation because everything runs through you, then you're starting to get good dialogue, right? Now, sometimes that takes outside facilitation to get that kind of courage, but it could at least be recognizing that the head of sales is too scattered on multiple accounts, and we need to focus our accounts to a narrower set of accounts in order to really unleash growth in a particular new market that we're trying here. Because look, a lot of people over the last 3 months, a lot of entrepreneurs threw a lot of mud at the fence to see what stuck, because the traditional market started drying up. And so I think we're now at a position where we need to start looking at everything we've tried to do. By the way, I'd be surprised if you haven't tried to do a lot of new things in the last few months. God bless you. That's a shame. But you could start at what's next to find growth. But if you have, you need to start looking at reconciling, because we've got a lot of efforts and a lot of energy out there. Now it's time to start refining. But at the same time, by using the bulletproofing process, we have no idea, given the time that this is being aired right now, we have no idea whether 1 month from now we're going to be back in lockdown. We don't know that, right? We have no idea whether or not the market receptivity for our products are going to shift or change. And by the way, that's an important question. I am working with pretty significant organizations and startups as well. And they're just making the assumption that the product market fit is still there. That is a crazy thing to do. If you're not really looking at product market fit right now in a real deliberate fashion with your organization, you're really off base. So, what is the market looking for? And by the way, thinking about this principle of teaming out, why aren't you bringing your client into that dialogue directly? You can have clients, prospects drop in for 10 to 15 minutes and answer questions with you with your earnest desire to be of service to them. They should be telling you what their most urgent and hot buttons are right now. And yet, we retrench as a team. We go into our hole, we get our work done. And it's worse if you're doing it by silo in your team, let alone collaboratively in your team, and let alone teaming out that includes your clients with this dialogue and critical experts to find new markets. I mean, there's going to be so much wealth degraded in this period, and so much wealth created in this period. And I just ask you, which one are you in, right? And that is your choice, but I promise you'll be on the degraded side if you're not practicing these principles, which rethink what leadership is, because you can't do it alone. You might get lucky, congratulations. But if you want to really fortify, you need to fortify with the capacity to have an extraordinary outed team working on this project collaboratively together in a psychologically safe, bold, innovative, agile, radically adaptable way. And I'm sorry, most organizations have not been run like that for 20 years. And it's time to do it right now and to reboot right now.
Excellent, Keith. Thank you so much. That's powerful. So I'm going to dive into the audience questions. We have
and I apologize, Barry, you cut out on me in terms of bandwidth. And I don't know if it's my issue with my connection or yours, but let's make the assumption I think I heard you, which is, what can you be doing with your clients right now? So I'll use an example of a company called Lee Hecht Harrison, LHH. LHH, I've been a client of mine, and this is an HR services organization. They provide coaching, training. Their primary business traditionally was in helping organizations that are letting people go from the organization and helping them land those individuals successfully. So LHH began to host a set of dialogues among CHROs that their head of sales in the East Coast, a guy named Frank Conju, began to facilitate, invited me in to help facilitate these conversations. And the conversation had nothing to do with selling them LHH services. The conversation had everything to do with understanding, using the philosophy of leading without authority and the principle of co-elevation, understanding how their clients could serve each other. What were their clients struggling with right now in this midst of pandemic, that LHH could be available to host their clients to come together and help each other. They identified an agenda that seemed to be the highest likely agenda. The rooms voted on the highest likely agendas. They then spent time on the highest likely agendas, and it was really extracting value from the network of their clients. Now, I've been doing this for years. I call this high-touch marketing, and it's really about using your marketing efforts to create a community among your clients and prospects to serve each other. And this has been, I think, companies that have begun to think about that have really begun to tap into a much deeper loyalty with their client base and their prospect base through that. So I'm sorry, that was not a great example of 1 minute, but that's a great example of what you're asking for. Begin to create a co-elevating community. And by the way, here's what happens next. Your clients start inviting their peers in. So now you expand your prospect group through your clients without ever asking for referrals.
Amazing. Thank you, Keith. Next one is from Aysen Demircan. The question is, she says, thank you for the super insightful webinar. Could we also hear about how to coach the team members to let go of their egos and not to be defensive when they're being challenged by other team members, even if there is psychological safety?
Yeah. So chapter 2 in the book is called It's All on You. And by the way, one of the things I might do if I were you, and I'm not trying to sell books here, but is put this book, Leading Without Authority, in that person's hand. Chapter 2, It's All on You, identifies the six deadly reasons why, I call them the deadly excuses, why we're incapable of leading without authority, why we're incapable of building this kind of co-elevation. And a lot of it has to do with the fear, the scarcity, and the egos of executives who are wrong-headed in their thinking. And I keep hitting people on the side of the head with this book, in the book. And chapter 1 even makes this one woman realize, her name was Sandy, that she was thinking about her peer as a barrier to her capacity to get a project done, when repositioning it as that person who was a barrier was actually her teammate and she was failing to lead. And once that repositioning of what her role is in partnership with that individual, she was actually able to co-create a better solution for the project she was working on. So look, I mean, if you really want to know the answer, it's you need an intervention. And it starts with an awakening. The book was written for that purpose, to hand to individuals to say, this is a model for how we should be working together. Let's start rethinking some of our traditional models. So that's what I would do. Aside from that, you can bring in whomever you're working on with right now as a coach or facilitator to really co-create what's stopping us from being this kind of co-elevation, and see if you can get that psychological safety into the room through outside support.
Thank you so much, Keith. Next one is from Hiran Doshi. He asks, can we get a 1-minute summary of the key points from Never Eat Alone? And
yeah, and I think I said it at the beginning. Number one is relationships need to be strategically identified and managed. So as you have your vision for getting through this pandemic and figuring out what your new market opportunities are, who's your team? And be bold as to naming those individuals way beyond your own organization. Number 2 is lead with generosity. Find ways to invite these individuals in for co-creation, like LHH did with their clients. It's interesting because people think that they're showing up to, if you're really doing this right, people don't think they're showing up for your team. They think they're showing up for their team. And that's the humility of leadership in this new era, where you are a humble facilitator of trying to achieve greatness with a group of individuals. And once you recognize that that is your job as a leader, you're inviting them into their team, not your own team. And that's, Never Eat Alone really speaks about that focus on other individuals. And then at the end of the day, the psychological safety, the vulnerability, the humility, the connection, the intimacy. People will take a hill for people they care about. There's a chapter in Leading Without Authority called Serve, Share, and Care. Serve, Share, and Care. And it's the formula for opening people to join your team. How am I going to get, somebody that I would have never thought that audaciously they would join my effort? How do I get that to happen? That's chapter 4, Serve, Share, and Care. And those same principles existed in Never Eat Alone.
Thank you, Keith. Next one is from Vikas Gupta. The question is, how does some of what you're saying apply to startups and early stage companies where business models, strategies, and team dynamics are fluid and ever evolving?
Yeah. There's a young company. So one of the things I've done recently is I've created something called FG Holdings. And I now coach a handful of startups that I believe and have bet on them being successful. And I open up my network to them, and I open up my coaching system to them. And I'm coaching a number of these small organizations. And I'm very excited about it because I've coached some of the unicorns, right? You know, like companies like Zoom, Eric Yuan. And these folks have gone so fast to scale. And I've seen companies and great organizations like Drew Houston's at, you know, at Box and Dropbox with that, Aaron. I've seen some organizations, unfortunately, adopt cultures that replicate the exact companies that they've disrupted. And in small organizations, the company is the team. The team is the company. It's one entity. There's maybe 10, 15 of you. So you need to act like that is your team and then follow the exact same model where, you know, you don't imagine your executive team being 3 founders and then there's everybody else. No, you have this beautiful ability to lead without authority through the whole organization. And that's what I've been doing with these startups. You really treat the whole company like your team, and the exact same principles are the same. And I think it's easier for startups to do this. But what's great about it is as you scale, be careful you don't just go hire a head of HR from a big company to spoil everything you've created.
Thank you, Keith. Great suggestion. Next one is from Adela Smau. She asks, she says, great timing for this conversation. Specifically, she leads a retail company, brick and mortar mainly, with 2,500 people, and it's structured in a more traditional organization. So obviously we don't have a ton of time to address this, but I guess for many of us that are maybe in much larger organizations, it's difficult to conceptualize how do you start this from all levels, especially if you have thousands.
You don't start from all levels. You can start it in any level though. If you're the leader, then you should start at your executive team. Your executive team needs to do this recontracting immediately, right? That's what needs to occur. And this can happen in literally a 3-hour meeting. In a 3-hour meeting, you agree as a team, and like all the formula is at virtualteamswin.com. And if you want to just walk through anything that I would teach you over a 5-hour period, you can do that at keithferrazzi.com and get that leadership course. But what you need to do is you need to think about immediately recontracting and then identifying the critical hills that you're going to be going through, as you probably already have those. And you need to start squeezing this team to be something different for each other. The powerful thing of that is then it cascades, right? Or if you're not actually the leader, if you're a leader, you can do it within your team. You can do it within the merchandising side of the organization. And so the idea there is you're now leading the transformation of the entire company from the perspective of merchandising, which means your team includes other sides of the business that you don't control, but you have to co-create with. Now imagine if every one of your team thought their job was to reinvent the company, and they're all working to co-create that, or meeting in their interdependencies, right? Wrestling together to stress test each other from their different points of view. You will find a solution much more robust than any one CEO or president could have achieved.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. One final audience question is from Cecile Moulard. She asks and says, great webinar. Anything that Keith can say about the need for trust and scaling trust in the organization in order to integrate constant change?
Number one, start using so the biggest thing that I'm now suggesting you do is reboot your staff meetings. Your culture of your company shows up in your staff meeting. And that's what this course is about. And that's what I'm trying to do. And that's what this book is about. How do you reboot the staff meeting for transformation? If you can change courage and challenge and candor and intimacy and connectivity into your staff meeting, I mean, just tomorrow, if you in your next staff meeting, show up and ask the simple question, what's going on in each of our lives, personally and professionally, that we're most struggling with? I don't know if you've had these dialogues, but there's been more vulnerability expressed in the last, weeks. There's a wonderful piece that I wrote on LinkedIn called Go Forward to Work. It was sort of the early piece that I wrote when I started this foundation. I think you can find it at Virtual Teams, but it starts to think about a set of practices you put into place, including how do you dip in with intimacy at the beginning of meetings? How do you utilize the Yoda moment? How do you shift to collaborative problem solving? We'll see if we can send that LinkedIn piece out to everybody. I'll look at it. It might be at Virtual Teams Win. If it's not, I'll make sure that we send it out to everybody.
Excellent, Keith. Thank you so much. So in the last 2 minutes we have left, if you were to share with us how we can best support you as a community.
No, thank you very much. Well, look, my dream right now is that we'll not go back to work, but we're going to go forward. That this is the inflection point to figuring out what is the future of work and how do we change our leadership to capture the growth that's available to us right now. So I just say a few things. Number one, get leading without authority. It's one of my proudest works that I've ever done. So I'm really excited about it. Get leading without authority. If you're a leader who wants to take this on yourself, then go to keithferrazzi.com and get the new course. It's everything I would teach you if I had 5 hours with you, but I do it in small groups of 10 minutes, just coaching you on how you can step up and start leading your team differently. So that's number two. And number three is go to virtualteamswin.com, explore there. There's a ton of free resources. That $2 million of the research, I parked it there. And if you'd like to engage with somebody at Ferrazzi Greenlight to do a remote reboot of your team, it's a 3-hour process, and we'll start to do that with you. So that's it. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. And I think the sort of the parting words of wisdom for you, I think, would be this. This is a very challenging and struggling time. There is extraordinary value pent up right now inside of your organization, and you're not tapping into it. I promise you. I've been in hundreds of teams, some of the most powerful organizations, successful organizations, coolest startups. And there's so much value created in how we've been leading that is not unleashed. And that is what I'm trying to bring to you. I'm trying to get your team to find that value creation for each other. And that shift from your overload to a shared load, it makes all the difference.
Absolutely. Well, I think today was both incredibly inspiring, but Keith, you really exemplify everything that you teach. So thank you for all the inspiration today. Very excited to dive into your work, and look forward to having another conversation again soon.
Me too, Barry. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Take care. See you all again soon. Have a great week. Thank you, Keith.